It looks like we have a good number of participants who've joined us thus far. So I'd like to say welcome everyone. My name is Sierra Leader. I'm hosting this session on behalf of the International Chamber of Commerce. First, let me thank the organizers of the WTO Public Forum 2021 such an important event and for allowing us to participate through this session. I would like to thank our panelists and all of you for attending today. In this session, our panelists will do a more resource-efficient circular economy. We will begin with an initial presentation to set the scene, after which a number of key stakeholders will discuss what barriers exist to the transition to a circular economy and how the WTO can contribute to providing solutions to overcome these barriers, starting at the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference later this year. Before moving to the initial presentation, let me ask the co-moderator, Ms. Ute John of the ICC Trade and Investment Commission to introduce the topic. Ute, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Sierra, and good afternoon to everybody in Geneva and to those who are participating online. My name is Ute John, and I'm very honored to represent the ICC's Trade and Investment Commission today and to introduce the topic of trade and circular economy. Indeed, this is also a crucial topic for my company, Daimler, which I represent in my day-to-day work. But today I speak on behalf of the ICC. So what is the main issue? The linear take, make, discard approach is still dominating many of our economic activities. And the international trading system has developed around this model. However, we witness that business is increasingly interested in a more circular approach, especially since companies are transforming and developing a more sustainable business model. We also need to have a closer look at trade, especially when it comes to driving and to supporting this transformation. The ICC, which represents more than 45 million companies, large, small, and middle, and with a huge network of more than 110, in more than 110 countries, has ever been a strong supporter of the multilateral trading system. And it is true that companies are the end user of the multilateral trading rules. And we need a WTO that functions effectively and that creates new rules to address global common challenges of our time, such as climate and circular economy. In this respect, the ICC is also working towards greater policy coherence across the multilateral trade agendas. I'm very much looking forward to Christoph's presentation and to the discussion afterwards, and I will give back the floor to Sierra. Thanks, Sierra, for having me.
Thank you so much, Ute. And indeed, if we want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, we urgently need coherence between the environmental and trade agendas. And we must be more active in exploring ways for trade to support and to drive solutions to our global challenges. We see a greater transition to circular models as being complementary to our action on climate as we work towards a more sustainable and resilient future. One of the key challenges is how we can work together to use trade rules to improve circularity on a global scale. But relatively little is known about the interaction between circular economy approaches and international trade policy. Which frameworks are enabling of circularity, and by contrast, which are inhibitors to a more sustainable model of production and consumption, for example? These questions need evidence-based answers grounded in the experience of real economy. And it is to this end that ICC Secretary General John Denton announced in late 2020 a major study in partnership with the Institute for International Trade that explores how trade interacts with the circular economy and will provide recommendations for WTO action. Our partner in this study is the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide, and I would like to introduce to you Christoph Bellman, the lead researcher on the study. Christoph is a visiting fellow at the Institute of International Trade of the University of Adelaide, a senior policy advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and an associate fellow at Chatham House. Since 2014, he has also served as advisor to the group of least developed countries and of Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific countries in WTO negotiations. As Christoph will note, the study on international trade and the circular economy is close to completion, and he will be sharing its preliminary recommendations today. The final report and case studies will be released at the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference later this year. After Christoph's presentation, I will introduce the panelists and ask them to provide their initial reactions to the draft findings. And if we have time, I will ask them a follow-up question. Please do put any questions from the audience into the Q&A function, and we will endeavor to get to them or get back to you with responses. Christoph, the floor is yours to introduce the study and draft findings.
Thanks a lot, Sierra. Let me share my screen. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, so let's start. Well, thanks a lot for the opportunity to share with you some of the preliminary findings of the report. As Sierra mentioned, this is the result of a joint project between ICC and the Institute for International Trade of the University of Adelaide. The idea was really to try to support the ongoing discussions at the WTO, particularly in the TESDI, the Structured Dialogue on Trade and Environmental Sustainability, in the run-up and after MC12. The whole process was guided by a reference group made of different WTO delegates, private sectors, experts, representatives, some of which are on the panel today. It's been doing both a kind of literature review, but also looking at a series of short case studies based on the experience of companies and looking at the challenges that they're facing on a day-to-day basis when they try to move towards more circular business models. So I'm just going to give you a sense of the report. The report is basically structured in two parts. The first is trying to articulate a little bit the trade and circular economy interface. And the second part really moves into some of the recommendations. So I will follow the same structure, starting with an overview of the trade and circular economy interface. You've probably seen this many times. This is just trying to illustrate graphically what are some of the business models that are associated with the circular economy. So you have here at the middle the kind of traditional model of extraction, production, and disposal, and the different arrows of different colors is the kinds of business models that try to promote a more circular approach. For example, in green, you have the kind of business models that try to look at extending the life of products through repair, refurbishing, remanufactured goods, secondhand goods. You have business models that look at kind of recycling some of the raw material. Others that are really focusing on having more circular supply chains. Others that really focus on product use and trying to introduce more efficiency through sharing platforms or by replacing or selling. You don't sell the products, but they sell a service. So you have all these kind of business models. What we've seen is that for them to be viable, they often rely on international trade to build on comparative advantages and allow for economies of scale. And actually, if you look at those value chains or those different business models, we see that trade is already happening at many stages of the value chains, being trade in waste and scrap, trade in secondary raw material, trade in second-hand goods, trade in goods for remanufacturing or refurbishment, and of course, trade in services. So if we look a little bit more closely at the trade flows and what is happening, when we look at trade in waste and scrap, that's probably where we have the largest trade flows, but also where we have the best data. It's roughly 95 billion according to the OECD in 2018. Most of it is metallic scrap. That's really the most traded types, 27% of primary metal exports. And the one with the highest economic potential. Paper is around 12%, plastic 3%. When we look, however, at secondary trade in secondary raw material, it is already a bit more difficult to identify those trade flows, not least because the harmonized system at the 6-digit level, which is what we use for trade statistics, does not really distinguish between secondary raw material and waste and scrap. We have some estimates by Chatham House, which is about 9.6 billion. But if you really want to have more disaggregated data, one has to look at the national level or the regional level, and the EU has some interesting data. seems to show that exports of recyclable raw material has been increasing by 60% in the last 15 years or so. And that in 2016, these represented 36% of total EU waste trade. So something that is growing in importance, but again, with limited data. Trade in secondhand goods or trade in goods for remanufacturing or refurbishment, that's even more complicated for the same reasons we can't really track the trade flows. Again, difficult to distinguish these goods from new products or from waste in the HS system. You only have HS codes for retreated tires, for worn clothes, and second-hand construction materials. So quite difficult to assess what is going on there, but we know that trade is happening and seems to be growing. Trade in services, well, that's the general problem that we have for all data on trading services in general. We don't really have reliable trade data. Some early work that has been undertaken by Citras and IASD tends to indicate that those circular economy related services that are most heavily traded tend to be IT services, professional, technical, and business services, leasing or rental, R&D, maintenance and repair, or professional services related to construction. Interestingly, a lot of small and medium enterprises involved in trading those services, particularly companies that are moving towards more circular business models. That's about trade flows. Looking at trade policy obstacles affecting the circular economy, the main one, or some of the big ones, is, of course, one is classification of end-of-life products. What I've already mentioned is not really a trade policy obstacle. It's just the fact that the HS codes that we have does not make this distinction between what is waste, what is scrap, what is secondary raw material. Does not make any distinction either between what is hazardous and non-hazardous waste. We also have a lot of differences across jurisdictions or from one country to another country in terms of product classification, and all this makes it more difficult and complicated to trade in some of these goods. Quantitative restrictions and bans, mostly for hazardous waste, but also some plastic waste, some metal waste, and this could be, in many cases, this is for good environmental reasons, and that shouldn't be considered as a trade obstacle. In other cases, it may also affect the investment in reverse supply chains, particularly if some hazardous wastes are really difficult to trade. And you know that in this area, you need to really have economies of scale to be able to recycle some of these things. So that's another aspect. Tariff protection, rules of origin seems to be less of an issue. There is some analysis by the WTO representative from the WTO Secretariat who have looked at some goods that could be considered as circular economy related goods. We've seen tariffs on average between 5.4% going up to 20, 50%. There is a bit of tariff escalation, some issues with rules of origin, particularly in electric vehicles. But by and large, this doesn't seem to be the most binding constraint in trade. Export restrictions, particularly on waste and scrap, seems to be much more prevalent. Up to 40% of copper and waste and scrap, 30% of aluminium, 20% of iron and steel. So that's quite frequent, and that, of course, also makes the use of secondary raw material more expensive. Regulations, standards, conformity assessment procedures. These are things like take back or recycling requirements, extended producer responsibility, mostly on e-waste, on electronic equipment, packaging, or batteries. Here the issue is not the regulation itself are not really a problem, but more the fact that you have differences across jurisdictions, lack of common definition of what is waste, what is not a waste. and sometimes requirements that are contradictory or incompatible from one country to the other. And of course, that generates an additional cost for companies that try to trade some of this material. Finally, subsidies. Think about fossil fuel subsidies, but also subsidies to plastic production or some metal production. These, of course, tend to provide a kind of negative incentives to perpetuate some kind of unsustainable practices. And that's, of course, some of an issue of concern. Many of these trade measures are being notified to the WTO. This gives you just a sense of what has been notified in the last 10 years or so by type of measures in different areas. Around 370 measures notifications. Also a number of specific trade concerns being raised in the TBT committee about classifications, standards, technical requirements. This basically to show that countries are increasingly using trade measures in the area of the circular economy, and these measures are being notified at the WTO. Now, so much for the general interface between circular economy and trade. Moving on to some of the recommendations, we've come up with 3 possible approaches, sorry, with a particular focus on the TESD, but arguably, the same could apply to other processes, including the informal dialogue on plastics or other processes. Basically, the idea is to have 3 kind of cumulative approaches, starting with the need to have some sort of a ministerial statement, which would put the issue of circular economy and trade firmly on the agenda of the TESD initiative, for example. Then start with a kind of exploratory work program, probably post MC12. And as a third step, looking at possible options for more concrete outcomes or more concrete deliverables, building on this exploratory work program. So I'll just go through these different approaches very, very quickly. A ministerial statement, that's really the first step, right? To say the idea is to put this on the agenda of the TESD initiative, maybe recognizing the role of trade in fostering a circular economy transition, the importance of policy coherence, mutual supportiveness of policies in both areas, and probably stressing the need for further work in this area, maybe giving some general guidance in terms of what could be the possible outcomes of discussions post MC12. So that's really the kind of first step, and sending a strong political signal that this should be an issue for discussion. The second step is probably to initiate some sort of an exploratory work program. The relationship between trade and circular economy is still relatively new. I think there's value in fostering transparency, promoting an exchange of information, but also promoting a dialogue between environment ministries, trade delegates, private sector, different stakeholders, institutions like the Basel Convention or the World Customs Organizations, and really trying to explore some of these linkages. In terms of areas of focus, I think one should look both at some of the trade policy obstacles that affect a circular economy transition, so issues of tariff protection, export restrictions, the classification, but also looking at some of the domestic circular economy policies that are being put in place, mostly in isolation, I would say, by a number of governments. And some of these policies have some trade implications. And so discussing also some of the trade implications, bit of quantitative restrictions, of EPR schemes, of standards, labeling schemes, and so on and so forth. So really looking at the both aspects. Now, moving beyond an exploratory discussion, at some point, I think the TESD initiative will be under pressure to to show that it can deliver also some outcomes, and that is not just a place where you can have nice discussions, but that should lead to something. That, of course, is always difficult in the WTO. It requires, if not consensus, at least a critical mass of interested countries. For this to be meaningful, it should probably involve also not only the traditional, champions, but also some developing countries, including large emerging economies. And we know that this, generating consensus for a specific outcome is difficult. So I think there's a value in thinking beyond, the traditional market access, binding commitments type of outcomes that one always think about when it comes to the WTO. And we're looking here at possible options, and I'll just go one by one. First, and that's the more kind of traditional way of looking at things, is if and when there is a revived discussion on environmental goods and services, as has been advocated by some members, the first thing might be to include circular economy and resource efficiency as one of the environmental category that should be considered in those negotiations if and when they restart. And that could be by proposing to focus on specific circular economy technologies like recycling, or specific challenges like resource management, and really put this as one of the aspects of the tools. The next step, of course, would be to identify specific goods and services that could be liberalized under an EGS initiative. There are examples in the literature. Some goods have already been identified in previous discussions on the environmental goods agreement. Interestingly, in the new version of the harmonized system, there are new codes that have been created, including which allow to differentiate goods based on their environmental benefits. I'm thinking, for example, of specific codes for electric vehicles, and that can help solve also some of the single-use concerns. The same will have to be done with services, identifying some services which are relevant to the circular economy. I'm giving a few examples here. The idea is to go beyond the traditional definition of environmental services in the CPC Division 94, which is a relatively narrow definition of environmental services. So that's for the kind of traditional talks. Another approach is to revive previous work that had started like 10 years ago in the WTO on remanufactured goods. There was actually a proposal back in 2010 for a ministerial decision by Japan, the US, and Switzerland on remanufactured goods. The idea was to review, focusing on non-tariff measures like import licensing, import prohibition, pre-shipment inspections, technical regulations. They were proposing to create a working group on trade in remanufactured goods to raise specific trade concerns, but also look at trade obstacles and how to eliminate them. So it was a very kind of pragmatic and specific approach. They came up with a definition of what remanufactured good is. And it's really looking at one segment of the value chains. And I think that's an interesting precedent. It could be extended to trade in refurbished or repaired goods or secondary raw materials, secondhand goods, but trying to follow a little bit that approach, which was already tested 10 years ago. The third and final idea or suggestions for more kind of specific outcomes is to work towards a set of common principles and sectoral best practices that should be followed by governments when they design their trade-related circular economy regulatory measures. So when you design your standards or your EPR scheme or your quantitative restrictions, here are a few things that you should be doing. Here are a few principles that you should be following. Here are a few best practices that you could use as a model to make sure that those regulations don't create unnecessary barriers to trade, while at the same time, of course, achieving the legitimate kind of environmental objective. This would probably have to be designed in cooperation with the private sector, with relevant organizations like the Basel Convention. You could apply this to particular sector or area, be it single-use plastics, be it hazardous waste or e-waste or chemicals. And you would think that in each of these areas, you would have different sets of principles or best practices. The interesting idea, I think, is that this would be like soft law prescriptions, probably of a non-binding nature, and not only because this is easier to achieve, but also because this might be more appropriate to deal with the type of non-tariff measures of a regulatory nature that we're seeing in the circular economy. So I think that's a very kind of pragmatic and immediate, realistic type of outcome that could be achieved. There are precedents in the system. The TBT work on regulatory practices, good regulatory practices, the telecom reference paper, the work on MSMEs. So I think it's not completely new to the system, but at the same time, it would be something that could be achieved relatively quickly and allow the initiative to show results. And I think ICC could definitely help with its broad network of companies to develop those principles and those best practices based on the experience and the day-to-day problems that companies are facing. So let me stop here and thanking you for your attention, and happy to answer any questions as we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Christophe. This certainly provides an excellent foundation for our panel discussion. I would first like to introduce our panelists. Shunta Yamaguchi is a policy analyst of the Environment and Economy Integration Division of the OECD Environment Directorate. He joined the OECD in 2014 and works on trade and environment issues since 2016. He serves as the Secretariat of the OECD Joint Working Party on Trade and Environment. His main areas of research include regional trade agreements and the environment, trade and the circular economy, and trade and climate change. Lisa Schroeder is the Global Director of Trade and Investment Policy for Dow. As part of the Corporate Global Government Affairs team, Lisa's responsibilities focus on trade policy, negotiations, and investment issues that foster growth in Dow's global business. The role drives bilateral, regional, and multilateral strategies to promote policies that secure market access and facilitate global trade across Dow's business operations and growth strategy. Malena Selmiolia, and I apologize for the pronunciation, is a senior specialist on circular economy at the Finnish innovation fund Citras. She is currently on leave from the Trade Department at the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Before joining the ministry, Malena worked at the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development in Geneva for 10 years, including as the Climate, Environment, and National Resources Senior Program Officer. So first, Shunta, I'd like to begin by asking you, what are your reactions to the report?
Yes, thank you very much, Sierra, and thank you very much to the ICC and the organizers for inviting me to this very distinguished event. And also thank you to Christophe for delivering such a rich presentation. I think I have 3 points to make in response. So first, as a starting point, I fully agree with the presentation that the circular economy has broad interlinkages with international trade. The presentation lays out this very nicely in a comprehensive way, covering global supply chains, end-of-life value chains, and also the role of services trade. I also share the notion that trade can contribute to a circular economy by help achieving economies of scale for materials to be better used. And therefore, trade impediments to the private sector in pursuing circular business models across borders need to be addressed. But at the same time, trade that leads to any negative environmental consequences need to be avoided, and how to strike the right balance is really at the core of this issue. My second point is that I fully agree with some of the trade impediments that are identified in this draft report. For trade to work for the circular economy, better transparency and traceability is necessary for trade to work for the circular economy. And in order to do so, further work can be considered in a number of ways. as raised in the report, this could be promoting trade in environmental goods and services that could contribute to a circular economy. There could be efforts to clarify different definitions and classifications, such as on waste, secondary materials, secondhand goods, and goods for refurbishment and manufacturing between countries, but also their relationship with the harmonized system codes. Another point is on standards, and there are a lot of circular economy related standards that are emerging at the moment, such as on recyclability, repairability, material content, material quality. And as mentioned by Christoph, these efforts are emerging in different jurisdictions. They're absolutely necessary to drive a circular economy transition, but we also hear from the businesses that regulatory fragmentation should be avoided to the extent possible to reduce any excessive trade costs and also to enable cross-border transactions. There's another point around regulations where efforts could be made, such as looking into APR schemes and how they account for end-of-life value chains, as some fractions are traded abroad and their fate is sometimes unknown. Also, efforts can also be made around the swift implementation of prior informed consent procedures and also tackling illegal waste trade. Also removing trade restrictions where possible, as mentioned by Christoph. Further areas of cooperation appear to be around sharing of best practices, looking into the avenues of aid for trade, trade facilitation, and also looking at the role of digital technology and innovation to secure the transparency and traceability that's necessary for trade to work for a circular economy. And my third and last point is that I really like how this report looks into possible ways forward for the WTO to advance on these issues. And I think this is truly the value added of this report. We're looking forward to a possible MC12 declaration on trade and environmental sustainability to address these issues, and also paving the way forward post MC12. So I'll stop here for now and I'll hand back to Sierra.
Well, thank you so much, Shunta. That's an excellent start to our discussion. I turn next to Lisa, and Lisa, I'd like to ask you, what are your initial reactions to the study and to its recommendations, and how do these align with the multilateral agenda?
Sierra, thank you so much, both for the question and for organizing such a great discussion. I'm honored to be amongst these panelists talking about what I consider to be a forward-looking report, and with congratulations to Christoph for having done the lion's share of the work on this. And I'll pick up where Shunta left off, thinking about those recommendations and how we can move forward. You know, what was laid out in the paper really does demonstrate a lot of areas of opportunity. And especially with what the world has gone through in the last 2 years, there's never been a better time to think about how we can be much more creative about engaging and creating opportunities for better practices, standards, path forward, as we think about how the world particularly strives to, promote global economic recovery. And quite frankly, WTO modernization and taking up these truly necessary agendas are a big part of that. For any industry, for any company, the WTO having multilateral rules is always the preference. It gives us all a level playing field and a clear understanding of how the world's going to work, so that everybody can compete based on best practices, the quality of their product, not necessarily discriminatory rules or challenges to access markets. That's particularly true for small business. That's going to be such a driver of global economic recovery. And when we think about how to do that, I want to pick up on a couple of points that Christoph raised. And the first really is very much like this conversation, and with thanks to the audience for from so many parts of the world for having joined us during what we know is a very busy public forum schedule. We really want to talk about and emphasize that role of consultation. Christoph highlighted the opportunity of bringing more environment ministries into this debate, and that's a really good example. We need to look at circular economy approaches in that comprehensive context. This is about creating better environmental practices, but also ones that support economic recovery, and for many developing countries, economic growth. This is also about job creation, especially in terms of driving innovation, so that we're managing the scarce resources on this planet so much better. So a key element of that consultation is obviously bringing in the private sector, and what industry's technical expertise can be critical in this area, particularly when we think about so many of the policy areas we've highlighted, like regulatory. That's an example of where companies, industries have an incredible amount of expertise to bring to the table in a way that really creates not just constructive policy, but very pragmatic. And we can also tie it to an element that all governments bring to these regulations when you think about the risk assessment or the trade impact assessment of these initiatives. Nobody knows better than the companies that are actually doing a lot of this trade. That's one of the reasons why we were really honored to be part of the work from the International Council of Chemical Associations to develop a WTO modernization paper that highlights a number of these areas where our chemical industry can align with some of the really good and practical recommendations that Christoph laid out and drive a more sustainable agenda. We've talked a lot, we hear a lot about the ideas of reviving the Environmental Goods Agreement, for example. But I think as we're clearly noting in this conversation, it can't just be about tariffs or classification. It needs to be about common best practices and regulatory issues that become the real barriers to deploying so much of the environmentally friendly technology, goods, and services that exist today and can start to make a difference for our communities now. We can even look at how we align and thread these themes through broader WTO initiatives such as investment facilitation. That's an area where all countries are looking to set standards of best practices, build capacity around how to have a truly impactful investment climate. That could also be a way about prioritizing and creating preferences for more sustainable investment projects that, again, will do right by our communities, especially in the near term, and deploy more of this commercially environmentally friendly technology. If we look at it in the context of, what are those broader barriers, whether it's investment, intellectual property, regulatory, customs issues that are preventing us from being able to deploy these technologies now. I'll go ahead and stop there so we can keep this great conversation across the panel going. Thanks, Yara.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Turning next to Malena. Malena, what similarities do you see between ICC's work on circular economy and Citras' ongoing work with Finnish companies?
Thank you so much, Sierra, and thanks for the invitations and congratulations to Christoph and colleagues for what looks to be the beginnings of a really great report. From Citras' side, we've also been delighted to be part in the process and hope to follow it as it goes ahead. So Sierra, as you say, at Citra, we have a lot of direct contact with Finnish companies in particular, many or most of which actually trade internationally. We've created a national roadmap for circular economy transition with companies on board there too, among others. And we've created what we call a playbook, which is a toolbox that companies can use when trying to figure out what works for them and how they can become more circular in their operations. And we have this list of interesting companies that really features what is out there in terms of circular economy. And here I'd like to just touch on how we've seen this development and expansion over the last years, and how circular economy business happens will also affect global value chains and trade policy needs. So in the beginning, the companies identified as circular economy companies were typically dealing with waste treatment and recycling, so very downstream. They were the businesses that were already part of then ongoing environmental goods and services negotiations, or the EGA negotiations. So they were kind of already on the radar screen. And the next category would really be companies that have been able to revolutionize resource and energy efficiency. Finland is a big producer of capital goods, and in this sector, a lot of qualities related to resource efficiency and circular economy, such as durability, repairability, modularity, and end-of-life recyclability of valuable materials, makes so much sense. So just to give you a really concrete example, one of the companies on our list is Kone Cranes. They make big and heavy machineries, such as cranes for ports, that have really long lifespans. And these long lifespans are supported not least by IoT and predictive maintenance. And this is typical. Digitalization plays an increasing role in all production and trade, but it's also really of key importance to driving circular economy. And that needs to be considered from the trade policy perspective as well. And so finally, we're also working with a lot of small and nimble circular economy companies that are operating more upstream and testing out new business models, such as those mentioned by Christoph. Many of them are startups that have global solutions and global ambitions from the very beginning. And again, just to give you one example from our Citras list of interesting circular economy companies, there's a company called Infinited Fiber. And this company has developed a technology to recycle used textiles into a super high quality new fabric. But they're not necessarily planning on building and operating a lot of textiles factories themselves. This is a technology company operating in the services space and licensing technology internationally. And that's how these solutions that will bring us within planetary boundaries can really be scaled up. So services and digital trade, as you said, are important to the circular economy. And a year ago, we did a study together with ISD in which we took an initial look at circular economy services trade and carried out a survey. Many of the respondents were similar to the Infinited Fiber case. So what did they say about trade policy and needs? When it came to trade obstacles, regulatory differences were what they pointed to, but some of them also said, actually almost 40% said that they didn't really sort of come across very big barriers. And the sense that we got in the interview was that they're operating in a new space. So this might have been one reason. And this is why what comes out in the study on just cooperating around evolving regulation and best practices seems really interesting. And I hope this gives a bit of a snapshot on how circular economy companies are also evolving, and they're becoming so diverse. And I think that in the recommendations from the ICC study, this really also comes across the different aspects and the evolving aspects of the circular economy. So thanks a lot. I'll stop here for now and get back later.
Thank you so much, Milena. Very interesting to hear about Citras' innovative work, and especially with so many of your companies at the front edge. I'd like to turn back to Shunta to focus specifically on WTO engagement. Shunta, could you tell us what are some key messages and lessons learned that should be communicated in the run-up to MC12?
Yes, thank you, Sierra, for raising this very important question. And I'd like to maybe share 3 points on the way forward for a mutually supportive trade and circular economy agenda at the WTO. My first point is that I think it's essential that the forthcoming declaration on trade and environmental sustainability at MC12 acknowledges the interlinkages between trade and circular economy, and also the potential role of trade to advance circular economy objectives. This is particularly important as we can see that there are a lot of trade impediments faced by businesses in pursuing circular economy business models across borders. This could be around differences in definitions and classifications or regulations and standards. There's also a stake to explore how trade can work for the circular economy, such as environmental goods and services and trade facilitation mechanisms. But there's definitely a role for policy action in international cooperation to help address these issues. My second point is that in terms of possible post-MC12 activities on trade and environmental sustainability, I believe it could be beneficial to work in segments, and including one of them being on trade and circular economy. And as recommended in this draft report, this process should undertake an inclusive dialogue with a broad range of stakeholders, including trade officials, environmental policymakers, as well as the private sector and civil society. And I think this is also important because the trade links of the circular economy is perhaps beginning to be on the radar of some businesses and some trade officials, But the real challenge is to perhaps transmit these messages to environmental policymakers who are central to circular economy policy making. And I think we've heard also from Christoph that involving the Ministry of Environment as a possible way forward. And I think I can fully support that. Third, in terms of possible post-MC12 outcomes, in addition to reviving the environmental goods agreement and also extending previous efforts on remanufactured goods, aiming to have sort of these guiding principles as a way forward is also a great recommendation of the support. And I think this is really important as there's no silver bullet to align trade and circular economy policies. And such an initiative really requires a lot of common understanding and common thinking among different stakeholders. Therefore, forging guiding principles could be a possible way forward towards a mutually supportive trade and circular economy agenda at the WTO. So that's all from my side. I'd like to hand back to Sierra. Thank you.
Lisa, I'd like to jump back to you and shift into a broader view again. From a private sector and trade policy perspective, where do you see opportunities to advance the circular economy agenda?
Thanks, Sierra. And I'm going to really build on what Shunta was just saying, because I think those next steps demonstrate real areas of opportunity, but also a way to reinforce a sense of urgency in this space. You know, we are not looking for, there is so much going on in this space now from the company's perspective, so much innovation going on, not just about how we work our own processes, but how we can really create a more circular economy approach across life cycles and value chains, how we're doing that, you know, across crossing borders and working in different markets. You know, these are things that are evolving now. And the more we can bring that conversation together, just as Shunta was saying, making sure we've got the right stakeholders in the room to maybe pull out a couple of the areas that are really about an enabling agenda for now. We're really looking at, there's such an opportunity to think about how we can tie this to critical technology that, again, starts to make a difference for our communities sooner rather than later. You know, Milena mentioned energy efficiency. That's a great area because you're really getting a twofer. You can look at energy efficiency both in terms of the manufacturing processes, which so many of us have invested in now for decades, but it's also about products, particularly in the building and construction space, that can drive a lot as so many countries focus now on infrastructure, a much more sustainable renewal in that industry and across that value chain. But if we also look at recycling technology, you know, a lot of which exists today, whether it's recycling or even as we're looking at, as mentioned, the remanufacturing space, there are so many things that we can be deploying right now if we had that better enabling agenda. And bringing together the right communities, particularly the stakeholders that are focused on innovation in this space, we can create that enabling agenda that thinks about, as Shunta was just describing, you know, best practices, principles of regulatory cooperation so that we're promoting innovation, not handicapping it. Looking at guiding principles, but also capacity building efforts, whether it's, you know, tying into great work the WTO is already doing in the trade facilitation space, or really expanding the capacity in key committees like the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee, to not just look at, you know, what are regulations being, you know, referred back to the WTO now, but what are the guiding principles that should define how we're looking at these opportunities going forward? Was mentioned before, many countries are looking at this space. But if we look at it just on a national basis or in a silo, you know, schemes like EPR have great opportunity to drive better practices on the ground now. And the more we coordinate on that, the more opportunity we're really going to be able to think about how we can deploy and commercialize these technologies, continue to encourage that innovation so that, you know, we're really creating a world where these opportunities are both doing environmentally better for the planet, but creating economic opportunities to restore, you know, health and opportunity for our citizens now. So I think the more we come back to that, the consultation around what is that near-term enabling agenda that can allow us to start to make a difference, demonstrate the benefits in a way that I think creates a lot of political will to continue to expand and build on what would be a very constructive agenda. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa, again. Malena, back to you from a more regional perspective. What is happening right now in the EU that is relevant for trade between the EU and other jurisdictions where circularity policies are being developed?
Thanks, Sierra. That's a good question. And a lot of the things that we've been hearing about are being developed in the EU at this moment when it comes to regulation. I'll also just start with saying a few words about Finland, as Finland is a circular economy forerunner within the EU. And earlier this year, we adopted a national strategy for promoting a circular economy with commitments to cap resource use in a way that total domestic consumption of raw materials in 2035, the year that will also be climate neutral, doesn't exceed that used in 2015. There's also a commitment for resource productivity to double between 2015 and 2035, and circular material use rate should also double. So this is an important driver for the economy that will then be underpinning trade and trade relations. And in some ways, it's kind of like we're seeing climate net zero commitments really cascading globally. And at Citras, we believe that material use commitments will be the next frontier, since we have to decouple economic growth from resource use to stay within the planet's safe operating space. And a lot is happening at the EU level. The EU adopted its new Circular Economy Action Plan in March 2020, and it really sets out the big picture for deep transformation of the economy. And one key element that is directly relevant to the discussion today is a new sustainable product policy. And of course, while sort of the more downstream measures are important, the focus has really moved upstream to design, since 80% of a product's environmental impact is determined during the design phase. And another important element here is that to really understand how circularity is being implemented, there will be a need for developing and expanding the use of digital product passports. So in practice, the EU has a new sustainable product initiative, which is based on eco-design, and actually based on the current eco-design that will be very much, directive that will be very much expanded. And at this point, I just wanted to give you one concrete example, which is batteries. It's one of the sectors moving first. This is, in general, batteries and battery production is going up very quickly. And the new regulation will cover the full life cycle of batteries, from sourcing to recycling. And it will be one of the early times where mandatory recycled content, material content requirements actually will be part of the deal. So that will create the actual market. And this then will go on to many different other product categories. And of course, there will be a lot of standards as well. And we've been talking about that earlier here. So this new product policy and standards will be built on the back of current product standards. Most materials and products already are subject to numerous quality and safety standards, so it's nothing new, and we're not starting from scratch. And for this reason, it's also an area where we need a lot of dialogue and exchange from the outset. And the proposal from ICC to bring this dialogue to Geneva is a really good one, really bringing together trade negotiators, standard setting bodies, as well as the private sector. So hearing from those carrying out the practical work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Malena, for these reflections. And thank you very much, of course, to all three of you for your very insightful expert remarks. I am pleased to see that we have a couple of minutes to answer some questions from the floor. So I'd like to begin with a question. What role can commercial diplomacy as the mainstream of foreign policy play in advancing and strengthening the role of the WTO? And I'm wondering, perhaps, Lisa, if we might put you on the spot for some thoughts on that from the private sector side.
Absolutely, happy to. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm very proud of that ICCA, our International Council of Chemical Associations paper that I referenced, in that that was a great example of bringing together a global industry, and one that's critical to most manufacturing value chains. You know, chemicals are a necessary input to 96% of all downstream manufacturing. The fact that we were able to bring everybody together and create a consensus set of what I consider to be pretty practical recommendations really does demonstrate, and I think it's a tangible example of what we mean by the commercial diplomacy. You know, that paper covered input from Latin America, Asia Pacific, the Gulf, our African partners. We're actually, a little preview, commercial interruption, we are having an ICCA WTO panel on the 30th as well, so I hope we'll see you all there. But it is a great example of where that's industry across the world at various stages of development that's all agreeing on the same thing. We need a strong and empowered WTO. And it went further. It wasn't just process challenges that we see, but it was much like we're talking about today, areas of opportunity. How can we take up that trade and sustainability agenda? How can we build on good work going on within industries, like in the regulatory cooperation space, to elevate these activities and bring them into an area where WTO is driving best practices, good standards, and guiding principles. So I think that's going to be critical. And papers like that, we're reaching out across our various industry value chains too, to do similar. How do we create a more creative discussion around what are some of those areas of opportunity? What can industry bring to the table in a way that helps translate and demonstrate, I think for our political leaders especially, the opportunity, both in the deployment of better environmental technologies and goods, but also how we're creating and tying this into increased economic activity that is so critical as the world looks to recover from COVID. So that commercial diplomacy, especially translating our ideas into the very practical potential, is a key part of really creating an agenda that everybody wants to work on. We're proud to be a part of that. We look forward to working across a wide range of industry and country value chains to make that happen.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thanks for just jumping in, unprepared for that question. We are approaching the end of our session, so I'm unfortunately going to have to skip a few other Q&A notes that came in, but I wanted to say thank you all so very much. On behalf of the International Chamber, we thank all of you, my co-moderator Ute, our panelists, of course, our audience for being here today. We appreciate your participation and we look forward very much to engaging with all of you going forward. The circular economy is a promising policy option in the drive towards greater sustainability worldwide, and there is much work to be done to overcome barriers to scaling up the global transition. As our discussion today reflected, the WTO and other multi-stakeholder initiatives can contribute to providing solutions to overcome these barriers, and business, of course, as the end user of the World Trade Organization rules, has a keen interest in ensuring that the WTO functions effectively and creates new rules for modern economies and to address global challenges. We see a greater transition to circular models as being complementary to our action on climate as we work towards a more sustainable and resilient future. And we hope you will be able to join us for the launch of the joint International Chamber of Commerce and Institute for International Trade study on international trade and the circular economy when it is released at the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference later this year. Thank you again all so much and have a really wonderful day wherever you are. Thank you also, Christoph, for your presentation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.